July 16, 1936, Sing Sing Prison, New York. On this date, within the walls of one of America's most well-known correctional institutions, the case of Mary Frances Creighton reached its final recorded stage in the criminal justice system. The setting, the time, and the procedures surrounding executions at Sing Sing Prison were governed by New York state law and documented through official prison records and contemporaneous reporting. For decades, Sing Sing had been designated as a site where the state of New York carried out capital punishment. Executions conducted there followed formal statutory procedures, with events recorded by prison officials and witnessed as required under law. Mary Frances Creighton's presence at Sing Sing was the result of a legal process that unfolded over time, beginning with a criminal charge, followed by investigation, trial, conviction, and sentencing. Each phase was preserved through court filings, judicial rulings, and correctional documentation. According to publicly available sources, Creighton had been convicted of a serious criminal offense involving the loss of human life. A jury returned a guilty verdict, and the court imposed the most severe penalty permitted under New York law at that time. As required in capital cases, the conviction and sentence were subject to judicial review. Appellate courts examined the trial proceedings, the evidence presented, and the application of the law. Their decisions became part of the permanent public record. By July 16, 1936, those legal proceedings had concluded, and the sentence remained in effect. This documentary examines how the case reached that point, not through rumor or speculation, but through documented facts drawn from court records, prison documentation, and contemporaneous reporting. Because before Sing Sing, there was a crime. Before the execution, there was a trial. And before July 16, 1936, there was a legal process that placed the name Mary Frances Creighton into the historical record of American capital punishment. The public record provides only a limited view into the personal life of Mary Frances Creighton. Unlike modern criminal cases, where extensive background information is often available, early 20th century records focus primarily on legal responsibility rather than personal history. As a result, much of what is known about Creighton comes from court documents and contemporaneous newspaper accounts produced in connection with her prosecution. According to publicly available sources, Mary Frances Creighton was an adult woman living in New York State at the time of the crime for which she was later convicted. Details such as her age, residence, and family or marital status appear in the record only where they were relevant to legal proceedings. There is no indication in the public record that Creighton was a public figure prior to her arrest. Her name did not appear in newspapers or legal filings until the case that would ultimately place her before the courts. Biographical information presented during the trial was introduced for legal purposes, not narrative completeness. These references were intended to establish identity, jurisdiction, and responsibility under the law. The surviving documentation does not offer insight into her private thoughts, motivations, or personal relationships beyond what was addressed in court. Such omissions reflect the standards of the period, when criminal cases were recorded as matters of fact rather than personal history. In the historical record, Mary Frances Creighton is defined not by a detailed life story, but by her role within a specific legal case. Her background, as preserved through public sources, begins where the justice system encountered her. Because, for the courts, her story did not begin with childhood or circumstance. It began with an accusation, and the legal process that followed. At the center of the case against Mary Frances Creighton was the death of another person. Public court records and contemporaneous newspaper reports identify the victim as the individual whose death formed the basis of the criminal charge. In legal proceedings, the victim was defined through factual details necessary to establish the crime: identity, circumstances, and cause of death. During the trial, the victim's death was confirmed through sworn testimony and official findings presented to the jury. These records documented how the death occurred and established its connection to the defendant, as required under law. Beyond those facts, the public record offers limited personal detail. The focus of the case was not on biography, but on responsibility and accountability. What remains clear in the historical record is that a life was lost, and that loss was the foundation upon which the prosecution built its case, setting into motion the legal process that would ultimately lead to a death sentence. According to public court records, the case against Mary Frances Creighton arose from a criminal act that resulted in the death of another person. The crime occurred prior to her arrest and was later examined through a formal investigation. Details of the event were presented in court through official reports, physical evidence, and sworn testimony. The prosecution argued that the death was the result of an unlawful act and that evidence linked Mary Frances Creighton to the crime. Those claims were tested during the trial through cross-examination and legal review. What remains in the public record is not a dramatized account, but a legal finding. A jury concluded that the evidence proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That determination transformed the event from an allegation into a conviction, and set the course for everything that followed. Following the discovery of the crime, law enforcement authorities opened a formal investigation, as documented in police reports and court records. Investigators examined the scene, collected physical evidence, and interviewed witnesses in order to establish the facts of the case. These findings were recorded in official reports and later reviewed by prosecutors. Public records show that, through this process, Mary Frances Creighton was identified as a suspect. Her arrest and the charges filed against her were carried out under established legal procedures. The investigation, as preserved in the court record, provided the evidentiary foundation for the case that would later be presented at trial. After her arrest, Mary Frances Creighton was questioned by law enforcement, as reflected in police reports and court records. Publicly available trial documents indicate that statements made during questioning were reviewed for admissibility and, where permitted, presented to the jury as evidence. Any such statements were examined under the legal standards of the time. The court record does not rely on speculation, but on what was formally introduced and tested during trial proceedings. These materials became part of the evidentiary record considered by the jury. Whether through statements, corroborating evidence, or testimony, the information obtained during questioning contributed to the case evaluated in court. The trial of Mary Frances Creighton was conducted in open court, in accordance with the legal procedures in place at the time. Public court records show that the prosecution presented evidence gathered during the investigation and called witnesses to testify under oath. These materials were entered into the record and examined by the court. The defense challenged the state's case through cross-examination and legal argument, as reflected in the trial transcript. Both sides were subject to the same procedural rules. After hearing the evidence and receiving instructions from the judge, the jury deliberated. According to the official record, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. That verdict resolved the question of criminal responsibility and moved the case into the sentencing phase. After sentencing, Mary Frances Creighton was transferred to death row, as required for those condemned under New York law. Public correctional records indicate that death row inmates were housed separately, under strict supervision and controlled routines. Their daily lives were structured by institutional rules, and movements and communications were limited and documented. During this time, Creighton's case remained under review through the appellate system. Judges examined trial procedures, evidence, and legal arguments, with all rulings preserved in public records. Official documentation shows that death row was a period of confinement, while legal remedies were pursued rather than a period of public attention or activity. The record focuses on procedural and institutional details rather than personal experience. This structured confinement continued until the conclusion of the appellate process, setting the stage for the final phase of the case. As the execution date approached, Mary Frances Creighton's case entered its final legal phase. Public court records indicate that the remaining appeals were reviewed by the appropriate judicial authorities. These filings focused on whether any legal or procedural errors had occurred during the trial or sentencing. Judges examined the record and issued written decisions, all of which became part of the public docket. Once all legal remedies were exhausted, the sentence remained in effect. Correctional records show that prison officials followed established procedures for housing and preparing the inmate for execution. Any petitions for clemency or reprieve were submitted through official channels and recorded in public documentation. By the time all appeals and reviews concluded, no legal barriers remained to prevent the sentence from being carried out. The case, as preserved in public records, was then ready to proceed to its final stage. In the early hours of July 16, 1936, at Sing Sing Prison in New York, the sentence imposed on Mary Frances Creighton was carried out. Public prison records and contemporary newspaper accounts confirm that the execution followed the procedures prescribed by New York state law at the time. Sing Sing served as the official site for executions, and the method used was electrocution. Correctional officials, medical personnel, and legally designated witnesses were present, as required by statute. The process was conducted according to established protocol, with each step documented by prison authorities. Following the administration of the sentence, a physician pronounced Mary Frances Creighton deceased. The execution was officially recorded, and the case was formally closed within the state's legal system. With that act, the judicial process that had begun years earlier reached its irreversible conclusion. Following the execution, the case of Mary Frances Creighton entered the historical record as a completed capital proceeding under New York law. Public prison documents confirmed the execution had been carried out in accordance with statute, and official notices were filed to formally close the case. The conviction, sentence, and execution became part of permanent court and correctional records. Contemporary newspaper reporting documented the event in factual terms, noting the date, location, and legal conclusion of the case. No further judicial action followed, as all legal processes had been exhausted prior to the execution. In the years that followed, the case remained referenced primarily through archival materials, court filings, prison records, and historical reporting, rather than ongoing legal or public developments. What remained was the record itself, a case resolved by the legal standards and capital punishment practices of its era. The case of Mary Frances Creighton remains part of the documented history of capital punishment in New York State. Public records preserve the details of the investigation, trial, sentencing, and execution, reflecting the legal standards and judicial practices of the 1930s. At that time, capital punishment was a lawful and widely used penalty, administered under procedures considered valid by the courts of the era. Historical reviews of executions at Sing Sing Prison frequently reference cases such as Creighton's to illustrate how the justice system functioned in the early 20th century. These records are studied not for their individual emotion, but for what they reveal about law, punishment, and due process during that period. As laws, social values, and legal interpretations evolved, New York would later move away from capital punishment. Cases like this remain in the public archive as fixed points in that legal history. What endures is not speculation, but documentation. A record of how justice was defined, applied, and concluded in a different time.